All right, we're going to give another 30 seconds or so, but we hit record. Welcome, dear friends. Well, I should say welcome to those who are joining us virtually and to those that are joining us here in person. It's wonderful. We're still figuring it. We're still getting the hang of things, getting our hybrid balance, but it's a blessing that we're able to get together both virtually and in person. And again, another 30 seconds or so, we'll let everybody else hop on. Let me check my email, see if anyone's having any issues. And then we are good to go. All righty. Yeah, a few of our attendees just messaged me. They're going to try to get the recording. They're not, their computer's acting up. One more message. All righty. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Jewish Learning Institute's Outsmarting Anti-Semitism here on Chabad Ocean Drive. Welcome those joining us in person, those that are joining us virtually, and now we'll add those who've requested and will be joining us in the coming days as they check out our audio recording. For those that are here in person or on Zoom, if you'd like a copy of tonight's evening, you're more than welcome to join. Doctor, you know this one, you're gonna like it. Well, you know, they tell about the terrorists who caught 3 captives and everyone's given a last request. The CNN reporter asked for a burger and fries. The BBC reporter asked to do a final report with the camera and, you know, rolling with the cameras rolling. The Israeli commando, who's the third guy, asked the terrorist to please be so kind as to kick him. They kick him really hard, and of course he rolls on the floor, pulls a pistol out of his sock. He takes care of the terrorists, and now thankfully they're free. So 2 other guys turn to the Israeli commando and say, come on, you have to put us through all that suspense. Couldn't you have taken care of business right away? And he says, what? And then they'll tell me I was the aggressor. They're going to accuse me of starting the fight. And it's a joke. I got a message, by the way. One of our viewers who were watching the film afterwards complained that we need to work on the humor over here. So we'll do our best. But this is no joke. We have an important topic to address tonight. And of course, that topic is Israel-centric anti-Semitism. It's no joke. It's very serious. It's something that no doubt all of us are familiar with, both by immediate exposure and today with the internet, with email, with the media, we are inundated with a vast amount of Israel-related anti-Semitism. You watch international news, you watch the BBC. There, I'm going to stay out of local television, but we all know that there's a very disappointing and high level of anti-Israel hatred, attempts to weaken or, God forbid, destroy the state of Israel. God forbid, ultimately, a desire to murder and to eliminate millions of Jews who at last are living safely in our land. And that's a reality that revolves around a lot of the present day anti-Semitism. And I want to share with you, for starters, a film by the great late, well, you'll see the great late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. And so, bear with me. Give me a thumbs up if the sound is working.
I don't have a picture of Bob of the Newmans and myself. Do you hear me, Rabbi?
Yes, Doctor, go ahead.
I don't have a picture on the screen of the, it says Barbara, so I don't have the Newmans, and I don't have mine. I have Miss Cohen and Mr. and Robert. Those
Does it still look that way, Doctor?
There's 3 people on the screen. You, Miss Cohen.
What you need to do, you need to try to click on where the screens are. You can minimize it, and then you'll see the screen. It's hard for me to troubleshoot it with you, but that is what is to be done.
I think he's saying
So-
that Barbara's camera's not on.
Yeah, that's fine. All right. So again, we're talking about a historic and modern hatred for Israel. Give me a thumbs up if you hear the sound.
On the eastern shore of Manhattan Island, the United Nations headquarters rises from a row of colored flags that represent a multitude of nations. Across the avenue, the Isaiah Wall proclaims a Jewish prophet's vision of universal peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The UN's mission is precisely that, to resolve armed conflicts and to foster global harmony. But inside the august chambers of the United Nations, founded in 1945 as a response to a war-ravaged world desperate for coexistence, Isaiah could have easily found himself the target of virulent condemnation had he survived into modern times. Isaiah lived in ancient Israel that for over a millennia included the territories that the UN considers illegally occupied by today's Jewish state. The Temple Mount that lies at the heart of Isaiah's prophecy is no longer considered by the UN to be the heritage or possession of the Jewish people. Indeed, the tiny country that Isaiah called home has become the focus of the majority of the UN's denunciations and has inspired more censure than all of today's tyrants put together. Iran, North Korea, and other brutal regimes systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, has murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians. Apparently, however, that isn't very important in the eyes of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, who continually pass one-sided resolutions that single out and condemn Israel. An overwhelmingly powerful bloc led by the Arab nations promotes a narrow and slanderous agenda meant to isolate Israel. This agenda has met little resistance. The UN's General Assembly votes on 70 to 100 resolutions annually. 15 to 20 of these regularly express disapproval of Israel. From 2016 until 2020, the Assembly adopted 122 resolutions criticizing various countries. 91 of these targeted Israel. That's 75% of all country-specific resolutions. And while 3/4 of this global forum's written rage lambastes the Jewish state, precious few of the most repressive or blood-soaked regimes on earth have received even a single rebuke. Emergency special sessions of the Assembly are rare. During the last 40 years, they've been convened for one purpose only: to condemn Israel. The Assembly's embrace of a terrorist entity has been equally astounding. In October 1974, 14 years before the Palestinian Liberation Organization even nominally forswore terrorism, the Assembly voted to invite a PLO spokesman to take part in its deliberations. This was the first time that anyone who is neither a government representative nor a head of a quasi-state was granted such a privilege. The following year, the Assembly awarded the PLO permanent representative status. A few months later, the UN infamously approved Resolution 3379, branding Zionism as a form of racism. At the time, Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, told his fellow delegates that Hitler would have felt at home listening to the UN debate on the measure.
For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such.
Since the 1993 Oslo Accords, hundreds of Israelis have been killed and thousands injured by Palestinian terror attacks. During the same period, the UN passed dozens of resolutions deploring Israel, but not one against the terror attacks. Since the 2006 creation of the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's human rights abusers have suffered nary a mild rebuke. Israel, on the other hand, is chastised as often as all of the rest of the countries combined, and in terms more condemnatory. At the Council's every meeting, a topic billed as, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories, is raised as a separate agenda item, while the remaining totality of mankind constitutes a single other point on the agenda. From 2006 to May 2021, Israel was condemned in no less than 94 Human Rights Council resolutions. During the same period, Syria was condemned 36 times, North Korea 14 times, and China has been spared condemnation altogether. Even within the walls of the UN, the absurdity of its anti-Israel bias is fleetingly, partially acknowledged. In September 2006, UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan conceded.
Supporters of Israel feel that it is harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often this is true, particularly in some UN bodies.
In August 2013, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon reflected on Israel's treatment at the UN.
There are some bias against the Israeli people and government.
In December 2016, he told the UN Security Council,
A disproportionate volume of resolutions, reports, and conferences criticizing Israel.
One of the more telling comments came inadvertently in November 2013, when a UN interpreter failed to silence her microphone as she addressed her colleague.
I mean, I think when you have 5 statements, not 5, like a total of 10 resolutions on Israel and Palestine, there's got to be something. C'est un peu trop, no? I mean, I know it's yes, it's right, but it's not there's other really bad happening. Nobody says anything about the other stuff. Apologies.
Okay, I understand there was a problem with interpretation.
Israel is not larger than 8,019 square miles in total. It is the Middle East's only functioning democracy and champion of human rights. It is a world provider of humanitarian disaster relief and medical, agricultural, ecological, scientific, technological, and security innovations. But when seen through the lens of historical UN bias, the overwhelming majority of all the world's evils and all of the world's ills belong to the tiny Jewish homeland in which Isaiah spoke his vision of swords being beaten into plowshares.
I hope I didn't get your blood pressure up, but it's aggravating for us to think about the delegitimization and the villainization that our land, our people in the state of Israel experience. So watching the media, you'll think Israelis are terrorists and occupiers. If you're watching the UN, we have all this evidence of absolute bias, vilifying Israel and treating Israel entirely unfairly. And the question we always ask is, where is this coming from? How does this make sense? How can the world be so twisted and so wrong? And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who I prematurely introduced, has some brilliant observations that we'll see. Text 1, page 84. Again, if you don't have a textbook, we'll read it. And this is by Lord Jonathan Sachs, Future Tense, the New Antisemitism. What is it and how do we deal with it? It's an article he writes called A Mutating Virus. He says as follows: anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. In fact, it's an endless stream of contradictions. The best way to understand it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense, an immune system. So how do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in doing so, defeats the immune system set up by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. Most people at most times feel a residual guilt at hating the innocent. Therefore, anti-Semitism has always had to find legitimation in the most prestigious sources of authority at any given time. in the first centuries of the Common Era. And again, in the Middle Ages, this was religion. Religion was the highest authority. This is why Judeophobia took the form of religious doctrine. We mentioned last week how you'll ask people of the faiths that are ostensibly, this is my outside of the text, related to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and we find a great degree of anti-Semitism in those faiths. In the 19th century, religion has lost its prestige and the supreme authority is science. So racial anti-Semitism was duly based on two pseudosciences: social Darwinism, the idea that society as a nature, the strong survive by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race. So you have a religion, and then when religion peters out, you have science as an authority to push and to promote anti-Semitism. And by the late 20th century, science lost its prestige, having given us the power to destroy life on Earth. Today, the supreme source of legitimacy is human rights. That's why Jews or the Jewish state are accused of the five primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity. And so Rabbi Sachs brilliantly observes that there's always an attempt to appeal to the highest authority and to paint the Jewish people, and in our present iteration, state of Israel, of the worst crimes that the present conventional wisdom presents. If you look on page 86, figure 3.1, so we have over here this very slide, well, a little different. You have the classic era in the Middle Ages where religion was the highest source of authority. And so they claim that Judaism is the enemy of religion. 19th century science. And so they have the claim that Jewish people are of an inferior race, using the claim of science, of course, by the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, to target the Jewish people. And today, the story is all about human rights, as if the Jewish people are prolific abusers, which we know is all insanity. And so the question, so we have such strong, clear, documented evidence about the mutating nature of the hate, and what remains the same is hatred. So the question becomes now, is there such a thing as legitimate criticism against Israeli policy? Or is all criticism anti-Semitic? And so you have those anti-Semites who will try to say that we're not anti-Semites, we're just being critical. And of course, in all fairness, I'm sure all of us have at times had legitimate complaints or disagreements with Israeli policy, and that's fine. Actually, 92% of American Jews say they are generally pro-Israel, but many of them are also critical of Israeli policy. So the question, again, is when is criticism of Israel anti-Semitic? And so there's a brilliant paradigm, there's a brilliant way to differentiate between legitimate criticism and criticism motivated by anti-Semitism. Or I should rephrase it, page 87 question, and actually do me a favor, if you're muted, I want to hear your opinions. How do you suppose we would distinguish between legitimate criticism, which is acceptable, versus criticism motivated by hatred, by anti-Semitism? Anyone want to share a thought? How might you distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate criticism? You have a lawyer in the house?
Historical revisionism, when people start to do like what was said in the video about Isaiah.
So you're saying
and they just, in the Holocaust deniers and the people who don't want to acknowledge accurate facts from a historical of history in order to fit their narrative, that's what really aggravates me, because there's no denying that the temple was where it was.
Oh.
I've been there. I see that.
Indeed.
Touch that. You see it behind me. It's like my, but when you hear people who are deny the Holocaust, deny, so anyhow, that's my.
Thank you. Joanna, you want to share something?
No. I've heard of the Natan Sharansky. I've read this before about.
Okay, hang on. We're going to go over that together. Don't give us a preview of what comes next. I want to know your own your own thoughts first. Anyone else have a perspective on how to distinguish between legitimate criticism or anti-Semitism? Dr. Moskowitz, any thoughts?
Hear me?
I hear you now. Go ahead.
Oh, because I don't have, my picture isn't on the. Okay.
What?
Yeah,
My picture.
live in Israel.
Wait.
Dr. Moskowitz, go ahead.
And the board with,
Oh, better.
if you're living in Israel and on the board instead of your parents, it's your children, and if you live there and served there and a part of it, yes, I can accept some criticism. But in New York, with the safety of Boca Raton, that it's his moral, the rabbi says his moral obligations to criticize Israel, yes, it's not legitimate. So in other words, I accept if you live life and you know the enemy is trying to kill you and all that, and your children,
In America.
it's legitimate. But coming from American Jews, it's pathetic.
So, Doctor, you're saying is when a person has skin in the game and they're making all of the investments, so then you feel that they're entitled to have criticism, but otherwise you feel that that's unfair and unwarranted. Thank you for sharing that, Doctor. Now, before we go to Nathan Sharansky's brilliant 3Ds, let's take a look at text 2. An ancient observation of the Midrash, observing 2,000 years ago or so, a hypocrisy that will sound quite familiar to this very day. Page 88, text 2. Very interesting. Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian, had a series of anti-Jewish decrees, including banning circumcision and banning Shabbat and other facets that were synonymous with the Jewish people. And an anonymous letter was issued in the name of a person called Imikantron. No one knows who he is because it was a pseudonym. Kantar sounds like a person who vexes or provokes or angers, because as you'll see soon, his complaint was not very well accepted by Emperor Hadrian. So here's what it writes. Imikantron wrote to the Emperor Hadrian, if it is circumcision you hate, well then Arabian tribes also circumcise. If it is Shabbat observance you despise, well the Kuthians similarly observe Shabbat. Clearly then, you simply hate the Jewish people and their God will exact punishment from you. So Imikantron, this anonymous writer of 2,000 years, says, Emperor, you blame the Jewish people of specific behavior that disturb you. But if we look and realize that all of these behaviors are prevalent by other tribes, other nations, other folks, the only common denominator between all of these decrees are you simply irrationally hate the Jewish people, and that's evidenced by your hypocrisy. And so one of the points that he's making, a powerful point, is that when a person is hypocritical in exclusively pointing out or targeting Jews for complaint or criticism, even though those very same criticisms apply to a much greater extent to other individuals, well then, Imikantron says, that's not going to work. Ironically, Hadrian really didn't like this letter, and he sought to kill the author. The problem was the guy wisely wrote it anonymously, and the emperor was unable to chase him down. And interestingly, the Medrash says that a certain Jew came and claimed that he wrote the letter. And the emperor says, you're going to be put to death. And he started celebrating. And he told Hadrian that he was suicidal because life was so miserable. And Hadrian says, you know what, I'm not going to give you what you want. And the Jew ends up escaping with his life. In the modern context, when we see people in organizations like the UN or the media accusing Israel of human rights violations, but give a pass to even more terrible abuses, and perhaps even voting them onto prestigious boards in the UN, well, it's a good chance that it's not really human rights that's interesting them, but they're using sophisticated language to project and to implement pure hate. And in the modern days, as Reb Nissim mentioned, Nathan Sharansky has the 3D test, ways to distinguish between legitimate criticism and anti-Semitic criticism. And you'll find there's some crossover between Nathan Sharansky's 3D test and the Midrash. So I'll ask you to turn kindly to page 89, text 3, where Nathan writes as follows. Do I need to give Nathan Sharansky's bio? We saw a video about him, was it 2 weeks ago? Famous refusenik, came to now an Israeli politician, a leader of the Jewish Agency, the chairman of the Jewish Agency. His story inspires countless Jews going through a variety of different challenges in life. But here's what he writes. Text 3, page 89. I believe we can apply a simple test. He writes, I call it the 3D test, to distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. And here we go. The first D is demonization. When the Jewish state is being demonized, Robert, some of these things are ideas that you shared. When Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and the Nazis, between the Palestinian refugee camps and Auschwitz, this is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. So the first thing is when there is demonization. The second of the 3 Ds is double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, again, very similar to the Midrash, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses, while the behavior of known and major abusers like China, Iran, Cuba, and Syria is ignored, when Israel's Magen David Adom, alone among the world's ambulance services, is denied the admission to the International Red Cross, I didn't even know that, this is anti-Semitism. So the second is the double standard. And the third D is delegitimization. So you have demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied, alone among all peoples on earth, this too is anti-Semitism. You know, they tell about Moishele. He owns a little deli, New York deli, and he's being interrogated by an IRS agent about his tax returns because he reported a net profit of $80,000 for the year. Moshe says, "Oh, officer, why don't you guys leave me alone? I work like a dog. Everyone in my family helps me out. And do you want to know how I make a measly, paltry $80,000? Officer says, "No, it's not your income that bothers us. It's the travel deductions. You listed 10 trips to Jerusalem for you and your wife. What's that about?" He said, "Oh, that. We also do deliveries." So not every Jew that claims to be harassed is anti-Semitism. But this is a very important rule, the 3 Ds. And now we can be equipped to better understand when we can confidently and comfortably point out a criticism or a case that's really an expression of Israel-related anti-Semitism. But as I'm sure we're all thinking, what can we do about it? And so there are a number of organizations that are involved in Hasbara, education, and activism. There are organizations and causes that try to help Israel economically and politically. And unfortunately, before the class started, Dr. Moskowitz and I were discussing how some organizations who were once active in pro-Israel advocacy seem to have lost their focus and sometimes seem to embrace movements and individuals that are very much not in line with supporting Israel. But we have to try to combat or support organizations that combat lies and half-truths, push back against the media narratives. And of course, we had a discussion that in addition to that, we also want to engage in spiritual endeavors alongside that. Today, in today's lesson, we're going to focus on a unique part of this problem. It's a special problem that I think hurts us more than anything else. And so as much as we are perturbed by anti-Semitism, demonization, double standards, and delegitimization, the thing that hurts even more than that is when it comes from our own. And so I want to take them in just a moment. I want to discuss that. First, let me catch up with our slides. Just a recap of what we just discussed. What can we do about it? Well, we should support organizations that advance Israel's interests economically, efforts of Hasbara, efforts of fighting back against lies. We should also be involved in spiritual endeavors to give a boost to the morale of the people of Israel. God willing, when feasible, we should do our best to visit Israel when possible, or support others that are going to Israel. These are all things that really can help give a boost and connect the world to Israel in a way that ultimately, hopefully, pushes back. But most painful of all, of course, is when Jews join forces with haters. And that's even more painful than plain old anti-Semitism. And particularly among the youth, and particularly in college, there is a very strong effort and movement among Jews who are schlepped along in the effort to demonize Israel, to treat Israel with a double standard, and even delegitimize the existence of Israel. And this is a problem that we really need to address, because when Jews join in with our haters, they lend legitimacy and strength to these terrible no-goodniks. If we can prevent or minimize Jewish people associating with anti-Israel anti-Semitism, will by extension also weaken the voice of radical anti-Semites in general. So the question is, why is it happening, and what can we do to prevent it? And of course, there are a number of theories, and we'll discuss some of them, but I want to first hear from you. What are your thoughts? Let's keep it like to a sentence or two, but I'd love to hear your opinions. What are your thoughts as to what's going on that Jewish kids are being verschleppt? They're getting involved in these anti-Israel efforts and narratives. Anyone have any thoughts? What's going on? Anyone want to share something? Barbara, any thoughts? You're muted, so I can't.
I think that if excuse me, if the family and the home imparts Jewish tradition and strength and identity as a Jew, I think that will help to prevent some of the youngsters from being swerved, being
Beautiful.
propaganda.
So Barbara, if I could rephrase what I think you're saying, is that if a kid doesn't have their own sense of what it means to be a Jew, and they don't have their own education from the home that causes them to be proud and informed, well, then it's going to be very hard for them to push back against overwhelming influence and overwhelming narrative that they might encounter in college or elsewhere. Thank you, Barbara, for sharing that. Anyone else want to share another perspective or thoughts about what's going on? Well, someone here in the studio is saying that maybe we need to do a little better with educating and hasbara kind of efforts, where sometimes we fail to aggressively put out good information and invest in that. So that is also a very good point. Thank you. Before we look into the present, we're going to frustrate Dr. Moskowitz, and we're going to look back into the past. Doctor, I say that because we love you. We're going to go back to analyze the story of Purim and the story of Hanukkah, and then we'll bring it into the present. So again, when Jews join haters, they give legitimacy and strength, and it's a terrible shanda. Well, here's what I want to share with you. There are two types of anti-Semitism, and I actually touched on it last week as well. You have what we might call Haman anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism of a Haman who wants to obliterate, destroy, and annihilate every single Jew. And then you'll have what we might call Hanukkah anti-Semitism, or Antiochus anti-Semitism. Of course, the story of Hanukkah is the holiday of Hanukkah is not far off. And the story of Hanukkah has its unique set of oppression and an attempt to eradicate the Jewish people. Purim, anti-Semitism, simple desire to kill the Jewish people. Hanukkah was a lot more complicated. There, they didn't want to destroy the Jewish people. They wanted to wipe out Jewish belief and their practices. So again, Haman anti-Semitism, like the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, they just hated the Jews for who they were. And when Haman anti-Semitism arises, very few Jews go along. It's not easy, thankfully, for a Jew to join the bandwagon of killing Jews or destroying the Jewish people, because it includes them for the most part. Hanukkah is a different story. Antiochus rules from the year 175 to 164, and he didn't really look to destroy the Jewish people. He didn't even want to ban all of Judaism. He sought specific ways. You want to have a seat? Come, grab a seat right over here. He sought specific ways to curb, to influence, and to make sure that Judaism just worked and looked the right way, that it should be consistent with how he wanted Judaism to be. They worshiped the body, so they wanted to ban circumcision. Shabbat, they thought promoted laziness, so they had to outrule that. They wanted to build a Greek gymnasium in Jerusalem to introduce Greek workout ethic and other parts of Greek culture. And what Antiochus and his friends did when they went to war, many Jews actually joined in with the cause. They wanted to be part of the modern, flashy, attractive, cutting-edge Hellenist society. But even more so, they wanted to be accepted into that culture and into that society. And they told themselves, we'll stay Jews, we'll be proud Jews. We won't denounce all of Judaism, we'll denounce the part of Judaism that's not popular to the Greeks. And they thought they were saving Judaism, and they thought they were able to extricate the association with Judaism and old ways and things that were not popular with the Greeks, and they support it. And even when Antiochus is going to go kill Jewish people for acting in a way that was opposing his belief, they felt that it was a necessary evil to help rehabilitate the Jewish image. Just going to the screen for a moment. A anti-Semitism that is not calling for the destruction of all Jews. It just wants to bully Judaism and dictate the terms that we can exist. If you don't have to reject Judaism, and you might convince yourself you're saving Judaism, and you're convinced yourself that you're plugged into a sophisticated worldview. This is what happened during the story of Hanukkah. And so that's the same story of anti-Israel or Israel-related anti-Semitism. You don't have to renounce Judaism. You could be a Jew. Just talk against the state of Israel and Jewish people living in Israel. You're saving Judaism. And it's sad to say there are people that I think really crazily convinced themselves. And on a college campus, you might even find yourself aligned with the most sophisticated worldview, because unfortunately, the prevailing narrative on campuses across the country and in academia is actually full of mishigas, and they convince themselves that this is a sophisticated way of seeing the world, anti-Israel. And they say, I don't want a Jew to be dead. I just want you to stop existing where you are, but that doesn't work that way. And that really is the story of Hanukkah, and we can find reflections of that in this very day. Actually, there's a cool article, text 4, page 91, from Dara Horn. She writes an article called The Cool Kids. And she writes as follows, again, page 91. Hanukkah anti-Semitism doesn't demand dead or expel Jews, at least not at first. Instead, it demands the destruction of Jewish civilization. This process requires not dead Jews, but Jews who are willing to give up aspects of civilization, Jewish civilization, that are deemed uncool. Of course, Judaism is always uncool, which is why cool people find it so threatening, and why Jews who are willing to become cool are absolutely needed or necessary for Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism to succeed. In the days of Antiochus, this type of anti-Semitism needed boys to go through painful genital surgery to prove that Jews weren't the problem, just the barbarity of Jewish law. Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism always promises Jews a kind of nobility, offering them the opportunity to cleanse themselves of whatever the people around them happen to find revolting. The Jewish traits designated as repulsive vary by country and time period, but they invariably contradict the specific values that the surrounding cultures have embraced as universal. Thanks to Judaism's inherent uncoolness, there'll never be a shortage of Jews willing to comply. So this is an interesting theory about the tragic fact that you have Jews who seem to embrace anti-Semitism, and again, particularly anti-Israel ideas. To get a little more specific. In progressive circles today, and especially on campuses, the prevailing cutting-edge philosophy sees the West as imperialist and oppressive forces to exploit indigenous peoples and minorities. This is the narrative that you'll hear. Israel, they claim, which was created by the Balfour Declaration, is an expression, to their mind, of imperialist racial ideology. And that's why they claim it has to be dismissed. They also say, well, what about a Jewish right to statehood? They said, it can't come at the expense of Palestinian rights, a right which they somehow extend throughout the entire, between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. And they even sometimes deny that the Jewish people are even a nation or a people, and they claim terribly, despicably, that the Jewish people don't deserve a state. Now, I don't need to really explain why this is wrong-headed. We all know that it's wrong. The problem is that this has become a prevailing philosophy in a lot of the places in academia and in the media, and tragically today, a new shift in American politics where we have a number of recently elected politicians who are unabashed to openly make these very statements that Jews don't deserve a land, that the Jews are the oppressors, and they try to paint the Jewish people in a terrible way. These Israel haters will deny, if they're asked outright, that they hate Jews or Judaism. And actually, some of these recently elected people had Jewish people on their chairs to be elected, and they hoodwinked those Jewish people to convince them they would be advocates for Israel. And their claim is that they're only opposed to the state because it's depriving the poor indigenous Palestinians of their land, violating their rights. And they say, oh, Jews can join our movement. You just have to denounce Israel. And this sounds, to me, too uncomfortably similar to this idea in the story of Hanukkah, where if you just denounce the Jewish people and their civilization and their land, and you're willing to buy into whatever we say Jews have to do, then you'll be acceptable. And again, there are a lot of Jews who think they're helping, and they don't realize that they're hurting and undermining and adopting a terrible, unethical, hateful, and ultimately murderous sentiment. And they allow these anti-Semitic groups to claim that it's not anti-Semitic. We have Jews on our side. What's even more painful is that there is a terrible double standard employed. The groups that are obsessed about Israel and the Jewish state, and they're always singling out Israel's problems, comfortably and without a problem, without any ethical qualms, ignore all other problems that happen in the world, because really this is simply the ancient, constantly mutating virus, and it's painful for us. So if we can't stop the haters, or we have to try, what can we do to stop Jews from joining the ranks of these movements, and how do we stop Jews from lending legitimacy? This is going to come to an unconventional conversation, but needs to start with, on page 93, exercise 3.1. The question is, maybe to prevent Jews from joining anti-Israel groups, maybe we need to educate them in a better way and more extensively, as Barbara said, about why Jews have a right to Israel. Because if people don't know why Jews have a right to Israel, it's very easy to schlep them into a movement that claims that the Jews are all the things that we just said. So let's go to exercise 3.1. What is the basis of the Jewish right to Israel? You could list, or you could write down or think of the three most common reasons that you encounter about why Jewish people have a right to the state of Israel. Now, if you'll be so gracious and kind, I'm talking too much. I'd love to hear your voice. Shout out one or two words, one of the reasons, the common basis why the Jewish people have a right to Israel. Who wants to go? Go ahead, Barbara.
It's in the Torah.
It's in the Torah. Great. Any other points? Why do Jews have a right to Israel?
They've been in the area of ad infinitum forever, from the beginning.
We are indigenous to that land. Our history has been there forever. Thank you, Dr. Moskowitz. Any other items to throw into the mix? Nisim?
If you want to speak the language of human rights, we're the only democracy in the Middle East.
A democracy. So it's a mechaya that there should be a democracy in the Middle East. Okay, very good. Anyone else? All right, let's go through let's just recap and review. So common arguments include, I'm surprised no one said this, international law, right? So one of the primary arguments, and actually someone did bring it up, it's part of world history. After the defeat of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, who controlled Israel for centuries, is dissolved. And then in 1917, we have the Balfour Declaration that His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And this declaration is part of the mandate, the British mandate for Palestine, issued by the League of Nations in 1922. And under the terms of the mandate, the League of Nations entrusted this region entitled Palestine to Great Britain for the purpose of creating a homeland for the Jewish people. So historically, from the Balfour Declaration in 1917, ratified in 1922, and then in 1947, the United Nations approved a different, smaller plan of the partition plan for Israel, dividing the region into two states. One for, folks, help me out. One for the Jewish people and one for the Arabs.
For the Arabs.
What happened next is the Jews accepted, the Arabs didn't. Israel, the state of Israel was proclaimed on May 14th, 1948. And therefore, the argument that's made is that international law, or by the virtue of international law, Jews are fully entitled to a state of Israel in the region where we currently exist. That's argument number one, in a nutshell. We could spend a year just talking about this, but that's in a nutshell. Argument number two is simple. The Jewish people have the right to survive like anybody else. And in order for Jews to survive, we need to have a state. We need to have our country. One of the driving forces behind modern Zionism was to find a solution for the persecution, anti-Semitism that Jews experienced in just about every single country they lived in. We have a history of over 2,000 years of persecution and expulsion, pogroms, and of course culminates with the Holocaust. And as the Nazis are killed our 6 million parents, brothers, sisters, and all the nations of the world closed their borders, including our very own, to some extent. And even as the Nazis fought, even as the Allies fought the Nazis, they did an imperfect job, if we could, in hindsight, be critical of their unwillingness to bomb the tracks, and other such failures and disappointment from the international world. And so the lesson learned, according to this argument, is that when you're stateless, you're powerless. You need to depend on other states for help. And only a sovereign state with our own government and country and army can defend ourselves. So that's a very strong and compelling moral argument that we can make, that it's the key to Jewish survival. Number three, Dr. Moskowitz's point. History. We need to educate our young ones about the fact that our people have a connection to the land that's proven historically and empirically for well over 3,000 years. The Jewish people have lived in this region, and it's been under Jewish sovereignty. Even beyond that, we have historical evidence pointing to King David, Solomon, the kingdom of Judea, Israel, and then, of course, vast amounts of archaeological evidence about the Second Commonwealth, meaning the Second Temple era, the Hasmonean kingdom and their dynasty. You go to Israel, travel anywhere, and you'll find writings, structures, clearly mikvahs, vessels, letters, strongly, clearly pointing to a strong, obvious, and solid Jewish presence in that region. Even when Israel was not, I'm sorry?
Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls.
Dead Sea Scrolls. Yes. There's so much evidence. No one even denies it. Well, the Palestinians are trying to destroy as much evidence as they can, but no one denies that Israel was there. And yes, Dr. Moskowitz, I guess you and I have another thing in common. We're enthralled by the Dead Sea Scrolls. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Joanne, you were saying something?
No, not me. The man, what's his name? The guy who's
Reuven David.
Rabbi, what do you mean that they don't deny that we were there? We just saw the video that they said that the temple is not real and that we don't have a title to the land.
You're right. The Palestinians. You're right. The Palestinians will try to will say that the Jews have no claim to Israel. But I'm saying anybody in the international world of any standing, anyone that's been to the area has no choice but to acknowledge that we have our history there.
The UN, and we heard about the anti-Semitism at the UN. They just had a segment in what you just played for us that we don't have a legitimate right to the temple.
Oh, so they might say, so first of all, now we're giving the case, we're giving the pushback, but the UN might say we don't have a right to Israel today, but no one with self-respecting will say that the Jewish people are not in the region. We'll discuss what, I think I know where you're getting. We'll get there in a moment.
Okay.
And so even when Israel was not under Jewish rule, it was under foreign rule, it was still the Jewish homeland. There was always a continuous population, even at one point down to a few thousand, but it was always the homeland for the Jewish people. And even when Jews were far from Israel, all of our prayer books and our writings are saturated with a constant, deep, and ongoing longing and connection to the land. And these three arguments are really strong and compelling. And when we combine them all together, We have the historic attachment. It's sanctioned by international law, and it's the only way to assure Jewish survival. These are important details that we need to teach our children and others, and to use them to expose the hypocrisy and the double standard of Israel haters, and point out so that it should be entirely clear that when they want to deny the Jewish people Israel, it's not because of reason, it's not because of science, it's not because of history, it's because of raw, pure anti-Semitism. The problem, as Reb Reuven David got to, is there are, unfortunately, not that we are weak in our conviction, but there are counter arguments to each one of these points in isolation. So therefore, in addition to these points, we need to make sure to shore up and add an additional dimension to our hasbara and an additional dimension to our education, to our own kids, to our own family, and to our own selves. So take a look, text 5. This is an article by Phyllis Bennis. Unfortunately, she's a self-proclaimed critic of Israel. She might qualify, I'm not here to, we're not here to vilify individuals. She might qualify as one of those Jewish people who unfortunately lend a voice to our haters. And so but she's very open, and she says, she makes an important case that at least we need to be aware of. She writes as follows: when I was a Jewish kid growing up in suburban LA, we thought being Jewish meant supporting Israel. There wasn't really a choice. If you identified as Jewish, as I and my friends did, the education we got, the groups we joined, the summer camps we played in were all grounded in one thing, not God. It was Zionism, the political project of settling Jewish people in Israel. Again, you can tell from her words where her bias is. My own break with Zionism came in my mid-20s after reading the letters of Zionism's founder, Theodor Herzl, imploring Cecil Rhodes, the leader of the British land theft in Africa, to support his work in Palestine. Their projects were both something colonial, Herzl assures Rhodes. The case she's making is that she was educated about parts of the Jewish case for Zionism, but it didn't endure, because when she developed a feeling of abhorrence to colonialism, she embraced a narrative that Israel, the settlement of Israel, was a colonialist effort. And they point to the current state of Israel, and they have, again, it's a very perverted and perverse perspective, but there is such a narrative, and simply talking about the international law didn't convince her. She says that was international law at a time where there was a lot of embracing of displacing indigenous peoples and establishing colonies. And so she rejects the British and the Balfour Declaration and all the legal arguments, along with her general sentiment of opposition to the colonial efforts. And so again, not that we're embracing her argument, but we should be aware that there are those that are conditioned to reject that case. Now, as for survival, well, you need a place to survive, but it doesn't mean you're entitled to Israel per se. Maybe pick somewhere else. An argument someone can make. We are not here to push back, God forbid, or to reject these points. We're here just to add an additional facet. So there are those that might argue that we should find another place to go. There are others that might say that are Jews really safer in Israel? We've been through a lot of wars since Jewish people arrived in Israel. So the entirety of our claim to Israel can't simply be about survival. Now, as for history, one might say, again, we're not supporting or making this case, one might say that just because we have a history, it doesn't guarantee us an eternal right to the land. It's the same as if, well, the Greeks might say, we should take back Egypt because the Greeks ruled Egypt for a while before it was taken by the Romans. And maybe the Dutch will say that they're entitled to New York. Or in my opinion, the indigenous, the Native Americans have a right to Israel. And more than that, the Jewish people aren't the only or even the earliest settlers of the land of Israel. You read the Bible, there were Canaanite tribes who were conquered. And even before the Canaanites, there were other tribes. And so the historic claim is also a little complicated. We're not here to make these cases. We're not here to endorse the veracity of these pushbacks, but rather to be aware of the fact that simply talking about international law, to talk about Jewish survival, or to talk about history leaves us a little short-changed. So therefore, of course, you know where I'm going. You're sitting and listening to a rabbi. We have to introduce Barbara's perspective. We'll get there in a moment. So we're going to talk about the Barbara doctrine. Do you mind if we call it that?
That's fine.
Okay. But first.
I love it, Bob.
So first, someone once wrote, sent a letter. Someone once sent a letter to the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And hold on. Someone wrote a letter to the Rebbe, and he says, I saw something terrible. I walked into a shul in New York to help make a minyan, and a guy joined, the 10th man, and he was sitting in the shul with a newspaper. Instead of praying, he was reading from the paper. Shanda, a Jew, disrespecting a house of worship, blah, blah, blah. And you know what the Rebbe's response was? Instead of vilifying the person, let's ask the question, why is there a Jew who doesn't feel comfortable praying in shul? He has a neshama, he has an attachment, he has a heritage. He was deprived, however, of the gift of a Jewish education. If he would have had a Jewish education, he wouldn't have this, quote, Jewish handicap in an ability to be comfortable in a shul. And so instead of simply looking at the person and vilifying them, let's understand what they're missing and help them supplement. And of course, his point was that every Jew and every person has a neshama, has a profound spark of goodness and closeness and connection and holiness. And let's say we talk about this Phyllis Bennis, who wrote a terrible article about why she rejects the Jewish people's right to Israel. But you got to sympathize and understand or empathize with where she's coming from. Her education about Judaism had nothing to do with the Torah, about God. It was all about, I'll use the word tikkun olam, doing good, which is great. We got to do good. But therefore, her next step was, to be a good Jew, I need to be anti-colonialist. And I have to embrace other tenets of liberalism at the expense of her Judaism. And that was a mistake. And then she talks about how the totality of her understanding of Israel is Theodor Herzl's project of political Zionism. It was important. He is one of the most important people to make sure that Jews could be in Israel today. But there was something missing from the equation. What was missing? Well, we need to make sure Jewish education is comprehensive, and we need to make sure that when we educate our youth and ourselves, we include the Barbara doctrine. We need to make sure to let ourselves know and let our kids know and our neighbors know that the real reason why the Jewish people have a history in Israel and the real reason why we have a legitimate tie to Israel for all time is because it goes all the way back to a word from God to his people. The creator of heaven and earth in the Bible explicitly writes and asserts that the Jewish people are entitled and have a right to the land of Israel. And the problem is, if what was her name? Phyllis? Not Phyllis. If Phyllis would have had this part of the education, there would have been an answer to her two big challenges, her two big problems with Israel. So sometimes you need to make sure that there's a proper education to nurture the flame. And we want to make sure that instead of attending a boycott Israel rally, we want to make sure they're going to Israel and connecting with their heritage. And so we need to turn to the Torah. I hope I'm not getting anybody nervous with this, but this is very important. We need to see how deep and extensive our tie to the land is. So this point was made by a very wise Jewish rabbi who lived almost 1,000 years ago, known as Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. If you'll turn to page 95, text 6, the very first word out of Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki's mouth in his commentary, his famous commentary on the Bible, is what we're going to read now. page 95. Rabbi Yitzchak stated, the Torah should have begun with a commandment to the Jewish people. The Torah could have started with an instruction for a practical action that the Jewish people need to do. Why did the Bible instead start with the creation narrative? Why did it start with the words we all know, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth? Why is that how God chooses to start the Bible? And the answer, the solution is found in the verse. He recounted the strength of his works to his people to give them the inheritance of nations. In other words, if the nations of the world accuse the Jews of a claim, you are thieves for having conquered the land of the nations, Jews should reply, the entire world is God's. He created it and granted it to whomever he desires. It was his will initially to have the local 7 nations, the Canaanites. Then it was his will subsequently to remove it from them and give it to us. So the very first verse in the Bible, according to the most famous commentator on the Bible, is Hashem is giving us a clue. Hashem is giving us a message. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. It's God's world, and God is allowed to choose to give a small sliver of that land to his people. This gift is eternal. Now, I want to point something out that's very interesting. What we now know is that the conversations that we're discussing and we're all aggravated about, denying the Jewish people a right to our land, this is not a new conversation. This is something our people have had to contend with for thousands of years. And so Rashi himself is familiar with this challenge, and it goes way beyond, well, it goes for the whole time of Jewish existence. In the year 1738, before the Common Era. So when I say 1738, I mean when the years used to get smaller instead of bigger. BCE, before the Common Era. Hashem, God tells Abraham to leave his birthplace, move to Israel. And when he arrives in Israel, God tells Abraham the following important words. These are words we need to be familiar with, and we need to make sure to educate our children and people around us as well. What's the verse? Text 7, page 97. God told Abraham, raise your eyes and look around from where you are to north and south, to east and west. All the land you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. God tells Abraham, it's printed in the Bible, and God chooses to give this land to Abraham eternally. God then continuously reasserts this promise throughout the book of Genesis to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. And then when he redeems the people from the land, from Egypt, from slavery, he tells Moses the plan. The plan is to go to the promised land, the land of Israel. Now, it may be true that for 2,000 years, since God, and even after God gives the land of Israel, there have been times that our people have not had political control, but it doesn't change the fact that it belongs to us. The Torah says that it was an eternal gift. We've got the deed. Maybe a squatter, but we've got the deed. And the Jewish people have an eternal right to the land, and when it's in our hands, like today, we hold on dearly because we are presently in possession of God's gift to the Jewish people. Problem is, if we don't imbue our next generation with a value for the Torah, well, we will be challenged. We'll have a hard time conveying this message. And so that's why, if you want to educate our children to have a vibrant and proud pro-Israel stance, we need to make sure that we also provide our children with a proud and vibrant pro-Torah, pro-God stance, making Judaism and Torah exciting, relevant, meaningful, and make sure that it's perceived as a current event. Now,
well, you have to teach it. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
You have to teach your children that they have to change the word from occupied to liberate it.
Yes.
You
Yes.
know, once you hear the BDS and all the rest say, no, it was liberated, don't accept, you know, let's go
saying
back.
a lot of times,
Let's go back before Haman.
when we accept the premise of a person that's talking or acting in bad faith, you've already awarded them. And so Doctor is saying, as soon as we accept their language, we've already given them a partial win, right?
100% right. So liberated, the land was liberated. But by the way, before Haman, in 408, King Constantine ruled that area of the world, and he embraced Christ, and he whatever decree or whatever the king does, because a lot of the Christians at that time, up until 400 AD, kept a lot of Jewish holidays. You know that, Rabbi.
Yes.
And then he said, if they do that, then they have to change their way or be exterminated. So it changed the whole world from then on in, up until then. So once we accept the fact, once our children understand that we liberated the land and it's not occupied, we might have a chance, but it's tough because could I got another 2 minutes?
Go ahead. It's tough.
My two granddaughters went to law school in New York, and the 3 years they were there, they didn't dare. They're very pro-Israeli, and they didn't dare open their mouths in law school because they would have a big problem with their professors.
Yeah.
So no matter what you teach your kids in school, it's tough to send them off to school at 17, 18, and 19, and they don't have a chance. You have the elites that. So it's more than just teaching them at home. It's got to be our Jewish organizations, our rabbis. I mean, you got to see AOC today.
Absolutely, 100%. Doctor, you're cutting out, so we don't hear you right now.
Okay, they burned the world down. It's okay, but if you want to save something, then you go to jail.
Yep. We're facing an uphill battle, but we have some fantastic building blocks. And we have some wonderful people that are in the fight and in the educational process. And this, again, we're going to go back to our point in a moment, but this is not a battle that's won wholesale. It's person by person. And every person that becomes educated and aware can then go on and further hold their own and also educate and illuminate others. And so for Jewish people, we want to teach them about the value of Torah so they can then receive a pro-Israel education, and by extension, hopefully we can keep them away from anti-Israel activities. But there's another question. Will this case, the case of the Bible, will the Barbara doctrine work against people that are not Jewish, against non-Jewish anti-Semitic voices? Well, first of all, hopefully, yes. A good number of non-Jewish folks also believe in the Torah, those of Islam and Christianity. So hopefully they will understand and appreciate that value. But even more importantly, people respect people who adhere and have strong convictions and beliefs. And when they see that this is a strongly held conviction and belief, it's not a political position, they, or a certain percentage of people, will have a greater degree of respect. But really, the most important audience, as the doctor said, it's our people, it's our fellow Jews. And so even if we can't win over every hater out there, we want to make sure that our own are educated and embraced and welcome. And that's an important thing. Now, I want to share with you a very interesting letter. It's something that you may have wondered, and it makes a very strong case. It's the case for Israel. And you'll notice, of course, we have the state of Israel, but you'll notice that there are people that study the Torah. The Torah doesn't use the word the state of Israel. It talks about Eretz Yisrael or Eretz HaKodesh, the Holy Land. And so which phraseology, which language should be preferred? So I'm sure we don't all agree on this, but I want to share with you a fascinating perspective. This is a letter from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was renowned for his pro-Israel stance, and he was known for his constant contact and support of Israeli politicians and generals. And the president, Zalman Shazar, wrote a letter to the Rebbe complaining that in their correspondences, the president of Israel, Zalman Shazar, talks about Medinat Yisrael, and the Rebbe in his correspondences talks about Eretz Yisrael, or Eretz HaKodesh. And so the Rebbe writes back, I've received complaints. This is text 8. And the question is an interesting question, but his point is even stronger. Why do I invoke the biblical land of Israel, the Holy Land? Why do I talk about the covenant with Abraham? Why do I mix God into the picture? Exactly the question. The Rebbe is asking, do we need the Barbara doctrine? After all, they say, those who fought for the creation of the state and those who led it, those who currently direct it, and its authored representatives, they proclaim and take pains to emphasize in the world that Israel is a state founded in 1948, because they want to hang their hats, rightfully so, on the legal grounds, the legal claim to Israel. And the Rebbe says, my answer, put frankly, is that their narrative is false. Why? No new entity was created in 48. That was the year in which a large part of the land of Israel, doctor, was liberated. Exactly your point.
Whoever said
exactly
that.
Your point. It was merely liberated.
Yeah, not occupied.
Established in 48 based on agreement or authorization of the nations of the world has no strength or justification in terms of an authentic response to claims you are thieves, you've conquered the land belonging to others, a claim that the Arabs raised, the Vatican, the United Nations, and tragically some Jews. So the Rebbe is saying basically the legal claim of 48, to assume that the whole story started there, is missing a very important part of the story. Now, I don't delude myself into imagining, this is an important line, that these just and honest arguments will prevail in the United Nations or the Vatican. The Rebbe is saying, I don't think that everybody in the United Nations is going to say, oh, it says in the Bible, and they'll accept it. Nevertheless, transmitting this truth is critical for the morale of Jewish youth living in Israel, serving in the IDF, and for Jewish American students and for Jewish youth of other countries as well. And so the Rebbe is making a call to not forget that Israel wasn't established in 48, it wasn't seized, it wasn't colonized, it wasn't occupied, but rather the Jewish people liberated a land that belonged to them for forever, since God promised it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so we don't only want to talk about how Israel is a land that exists because of a promise of the UN or the League of Nations. We want to talk about that Israel is a promised land. And the covenant with Abraham and God is much more powerful and precedes the covenant and international treaties. It's not going to change everyone's mind, but we need to know the truth. We need to be proud of our claim that starts with the Bible, and it'll invigorate, empower, and give more pride to Jewish kids on the front lines, pushing back against a chorus that claims Israel's a stolen country and a place that oppresses and colonizers. And so to fully communicate, we need to make sure that we have all four arguments: the historic, the legal, the survival, and most importantly, the Barbara doctrine. It was promised by God to the Jewish people in the Torah for all times. And that is an important fourth facet that enables, empowers, and gives extra strength to all the other three. Now, this is an important case, a case we need to fill our minds, we need to be fully convinced and advocate to others. But I do want to take you for a moment into a more Kabbalistic, esoteric realm. I want to talk about the metaphysics of Israel. And there's an interesting question. God, spiritual. The Torah is spiritual. What God wants ostensibly is the Jewish people to become more connected to God, to the Spirit. Why does God want the Jewish people to have a land? Why is Judaism connected to a world, to material? Shouldn't it be about escaping planet Earth, being more removed from the world? And this is the more esoteric claim. The nations of the world tell God and the Jewish people, you don't need a land. Because you're a religion that's all about spirituality. Who needs a land? As a matter of fact, the Jewish people survived quite well even without a land. Our peoplehood isn't based on a land. What is the common bond that affects the Jewish identity for the last 2,000 years? It might be stated that it is the Torah. Now, that's not to say that every Jew, that a person that's not connected to Torah is not Jewish, not at all. But if we'll dig back to our most recent history, every person on this Zoom has a grandfather or a great-grandfather whose entire lifestyle and worldview was shaped and informed by their Jewish practices. And so a claim might be made that the Jewish people don't need a land, they just need the Torah. Why do we need geography? Can't we transcend the material? And this is actually, again, the deeper question. Why should Jews claim ownership over this land, over a physical land? Aren't we involved in a spiritual process? And so, page 100, text 9, real fast. Sadia Gaon, great Jewish philosopher, scholar who lived 882 to 942, a long while ago. He says the Jewish nation only is a nation through its Torah. Now, we might not like this comment, but I want to just make a point. If anybody rejected Torah in the year 882, their descendants are not Jewish today. I can say that with absolute certainty. If a person considers themselves Jewish today, it's because in their recent past, the Jewish identity, the story of the Jewish people, the story of the Torah, the teachings of the Torah somehow touched and connected to their existence. And that's the question, and that's the answer. Again, why does the Torah communicate with the nations? Why does the Torah start off with this? Because we're conveying, an important message. Text 10, page 102. We're going to do this really fast. An objective, unprejudiced survey of the Jewish history of the people brings to light that our survival is not because of wealth or strength. Even in most prosperous times, I'm paraphrasing, the Jewish people were not as prosperous as other nations. It's not an active statehood or control of our geographic homeland that secured our existence, because for the bulk of the exile, we were without a kingdom or homeland. It's not even our language, because the language that the people of Israel, the Jewish people, converse with evolved as well. From Hebrew to Aramaic, to Arabic, to Yiddish, to Ladino, to English. Our language has not been a constant. Our culture, our secular culture, our cookbooks have evolved over 1,000 years. Our clothing is very different. Our tunes, that too has not been a constant. The only constant is the existence of Torah and mitzvot and specific practices that connected the Jewish people to their God. And that's the question. If that's the case, why do we need a land? The answer, this is text 11, 104. The Jewish people have a unique relationship to the land, because our job, our spiritual mission is to take the world, to take a land and imbue it with holiness, to take a mundane world and fill it with mitzvot, take a mundane world and fill it up with Torah, bring God into the land. And this is most strongly represented in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And although our existence is not dependent on a land, but the land of Israel is what embodies our life mission to make the world a holy place. So other nations are bound by geography. The Jewish people are bound by Torah. So why does God give us the land of Israel? Because our job is to take a physical world, to take Eretz Yisrael, or to take Eretz, to take the earth, to take the world, and turn it into Eretz Yisrael, turn it into a holy land. And the physical world becomes a place where there is godly revelation. That's why we exist. That's what the Torah calls us to do. And therefore, Jewish existence is entirely compatible with the physical world, because our job is to quote unquote conquer the physical world. If you look at these cute images here, you have parchment, and is that parchment? You have tools and candles, and that looks like a shofar that's not yet finished, or maybe the Torah scroll or gold. And our job is to turn the parchment into tefillin, the wax into Shabbat candles, the ram after 120 into a shofar, and gold or wealth is transformed into tzedakah to support and promote Jewish values and Jewish life. And when we do that, we can create a Jewish space and a Jewish society, and that's what we can hope for as a people in the land of Israel. To close, or let's just say this. First of all, what we need to do is we need to develop strong sentiments in our people with a rich education, fostering a love for God, developing an appreciation for Torah, and we'll have the keys to our survival. We'll have the case for our land, and we'll be able to be assured of a bright Jewish tomorrow. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, famous Jewish poet, 1075 to 1141, has a famous poem. I'm sure you've heard it. My heart is in the east, libi b'mizrach. My heart is in the east, but I am at the ends of the west. He was talking about the fact that he lived in Spain, but his passion, his love, and his hopes were all in Israel. He says, how can I taste what I eat? How could it be savored if Zion is still fettered of Rome? The fact that in his life, Israel was controlled by the Crusaders caused him pain. We too need to develop this deep emotional attachment to our land, to our people, to our Torah, to our God. And when we embrace this and we incorporate these themes into our language, into our conversation, we'll come out the most empowered, most informed, and most compelling advocates against anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, and we can proudly support and encourage people to realize our connection to the land of Israel. And until then, we must do our best to push back against anti-Israel, the boycott, the BDS, and the like, and look forward to a day when we will successfully remove anti-Israel hate. And that can be best embodied with a picture of the Holy Temple that will be rebuilt, God willing, with the arrival of Mashiach, where all claims and all attempts to sever our attachment to the land will be forever thwarted. May it be speedily in our days, and certainly it will be with thanks to the deep effort, education, and passion we share with ourselves, with our family, with our neighbors, and with the entire world. And so with that, my dear friends, I want to close out our formal part of lesson 3, Outsmarting Anti-Semitism, some points about the problems we face with the Promised Land and how we can up our game and further push back and make the cases that need to be made. Want to follow up, continued learning, you can go to myjli.com/anti-Semitism. I am going to stop. Hold on. Sorry, I need to move this to my screen. All right, for the next few minutes, there's a lot of additional thoughts that probably haven't been brought up. So I would like to welcome and encourage those in person and those who are joining us online to share additional thoughts about what we can do to push back against anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, or Israel-related anti-Semitism, and how we can better educate our own to be more proud of our heritage, our land, our people, and our Torah. It's going to be a first come, first serve. So speak up, and the mic is yours.
I have a question about Hebrew.
Go ahead.
In 1973, Richard Nixon saved the land of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Henry Kissinger was also basically his friend, his Secretary of State, his court Jew, as it were. Now,
Okay.
Richard Nixon Richard Nixon was, to be quite honest, he was an anti-Semite. He didn't like American Jews. In fact, I would almost go to as far as to say that he hated some liberal Jews. But
Okay.
Kissinger worked on him and managed to sort of realpolitik him into supporting Israel for the Cold War against the Russians for those reasons. So my question is, do we work with, if in order to benefit Israel, do we work with some anti-Semites who are lower on the spectrum in order for some higher goal? Or is that a dangerous thing to be tangled up with them because they could just as easily turn on us? I'm just throwing that. I don't know the answer.
You're asking a great question. I want to share with you. Here's a video. So hold on. You know what? Give me a second. I'm glad you asked that. I'm going to look for a short clip that I actually was thinking to share with you. Jesse.
Rabbi, while you're looking, do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, doctor.
While you're looking, I just want to tell Mr. Cohen, the facts of the matter is that Nixon said there's no way I can do it because we needed oil from the Arabs. And he sent Kissinger over to there. He sent Kissinger to, and Golda Meir was the prime minister. And Golda Meir said to Kissinger, says, look, they're on the doorsteps. If you don't give us aid, we're going to have to use the atom bomb. And we're going to using the atom bomb. So you go back and tell President
Nixon.
Israel is going to use the atom bomb and we better do something. So Nixon couldn't use American. We didn't use MATS, military. I was an Air Force veteran. We didn't use. We used the private planes to send them all the equipment we needed to turn to reverse the war. And then when Kissinger went back to Golda Meir and asked her, "Do you really have the atom bomb?" She says, "You'll never."
Wait,
know.
what was that? Oh, we lost you. What was that?
Golda Meir told Kissinger to tell Nixon that they're going to. Nixon wouldn't give in because he was going to use American airplanes without signing. And we can anger the Arabs, and we were completely dependent on Arabs for our very existence with their oil. The U.S. State Department was anti-Israel from the start because of oil, and then finally we got a president that made us oil dependent, and we got this our new president, I guess, whatever. Anyway, to think that Nixon, whether he was an anti-Semite or not, the answer to your problem is not whether they're anti-Semitic or not. It's got to be that you're strong, and that's the whole key. Israel's got to stay strong, and you win by strength. You know,
Doctor, can I interrupt you for a moment?
Get angry. Get angry.
Okay.
Yeah. But it was also economic and political.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Wow.
All right, I can't find the film right now. So, but long story short, Alan Dershowitz complained. You know the story? Alan Dershowitz wrote a very strong letter. He tells it. I just can't find the film of Alan Dershowitz complaining to the Rebbe because the Lubavitch movement honored Jesse Helms, who was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he was understood to be anti-Israel and to be generally, again, I don't know this firsthand, but from his interview, he was not considered a very wonderful person in the eyes of Alan Dershowitz and those who are trying to support and promote Israel. And Chabad honored him. And he says, I wrote a letter. How can you honor a man who stands for everything that is opposed to Jewish values in America? And he writes that the Rebbe wrote a very respectful letter telling him that we must never give up on anyone. Never give up on someone. Today, Jesse Helms is against Israel, but tomorrow, if we know the right way to approach him, he could even become a champion of Israel. He writes this in a letter to Alan Dershowitz. And I have to tell you, I had my doubts about it. I'm sorry, Alan Dershowitz writes, I had my doubts about it, but as they say, the rest is history. And although I disagree much with Jesse Helms, he eventually did become an important advocate for Israel.
Wow.
And so he writes how the Rebbe says that it's going to happen. And indeed, again, I don't know the specifics. I was hoping to find the video. So, Nisim, to your point, we shouldn't write people off. We should try to always, we shouldn't be naive, but we should always give people a chance to evolve in their views and and with the right diplomacy and advocacy, we will find successes and we'll find people that are evolving and you know, and improving on this subject. So
Right.
that's a perspective that's good to share. Any other
Thanks.
thoughts before we close out the evening?
Alan Dershowitz wrote the book called A Case for Israel. That was one of his writings.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting how he talked about how Israel is always blamed when they stand up for themselves.
Yep. You can do no right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all, those on the virtual world, those in person. Thank you all for joining us. It is so wonderful to see you. God willing, next week will be lesson 4. I hope some of those who are going to be joining us on the recording will be able to join us for the final session. I want to thank you all for greatly enriching the conversation. Have a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you next week, Wednesday, 7 p.m. Toda rabba.
Thank you,
Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye
Have a
bye.
good night.
You
Have a
too.
good night.
You as well.
Thank you.